Here's something almost nobody will tell you, because it sounds, at first, like the kind of thing you'd read on a poster in a dentist's waiting room. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again. Not because the world is about to become kind. Not because people will stop leaving, lying, disappointing, betraying. They won't. The world isn't going to change for you, and honestly, it was never supposed to. What's about to change is something far more interesting and far more uncomfortable to admit. It's you. For most of your life, you've probably believed a version of reality that feels obvious, almost too obvious to question. Other people have the power to hurt you. The ex who left without an explanation. The parent who never said I'm proud of you. The friend who disappeared the moment things got hard. It feels true. It feels like common sense. But here's the paradox that's about to unravel everything you thought you understood about your own pain. What if none of them ever actually had that power to begin with? What if the wound was already open, long before they walked through the door, and they simply happened to be standing there when it reopened? This isn't another video about healing your inner child in some vague, feel-good way that leaves you exactly where you started by the time the credits roll. This is something far more specific and far more useful, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why certain people, certain situations, certain words have had the power to destroy your entire week, and exactly why that power is about to disappear completely. Not because you'll avoid those situations, but because you won't need to anymore. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying the parts of the human psyche that operate in the dark, the parts most people never examine, because examining them is uncomfortable, even frightening. But here's the reward waiting on the other side of that discomfort. People who've done this work, who've actually met the parts of themselves running the show from the shadows, reach a point where insults don't land the way they used to. Rejection doesn't spiral into death. There's a story most people never get told about themselves, and it's this. Somewhere along the way, you built a wall, and you called it protection. You told yourself it was there to keep the world out, the betrayals, the disappointments, the people who said they'd stay and didn't. But here's the part nobody warns you about. That wall doesn't just keep the world out. It keeps you in. And the version of you that's trapped inside isn't the strong one. It's the soft one. The one who still believes in things. The one you decided was too dangerous to let out into the light again. Think about it like this. Imagine a knight who's worn the same suit of armor for so many years that he's forgotten there's skin underneath it. The armor was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to get him through one battle, maybe two. But somewhere along the way, he stopped taking it off at night. He started sleeping in it, eating in it, loving in it, if you can call it loving when there's steel between two hearts. That's not protection anymore. That's a prison with really good PR. And the cruelest part is, he built it himself, plate by plate, decision by decision. Every time he said, I won't let that happen to me again. You can see this everywhere once you know what you're looking for. The person who keeps everyone at arm's length and calls it having standards. The one who never fully commits to a relationship, a career, a city, because somewhere in the back of their mind, commitment equals exposure, and exposure equals pain. If this sounds familiar, here's a practical place to start, not by tearing the armor off all at once, because that's not how trust gets rebuilt, but by noticing one small moment a day where you choose to stay open instead of bracing. Maybe it's answering a text honestly instead of with a guarded one-liner. Maybe it's telling a friend you're actually struggling instead of saying I'm fine. Carl Jung wrote extensively about this kind of self-protection in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and if you want to go deeper into how the psyche builds these defenses, that book is a remarkable place to sit with it. So here's the real question nobody asks enough. What would you have to feel if you finally took the armor off? Because that's usually the actual reason it's still on. It's not that the world out there is so dangerous. It's that whatever is sitting underneath all that steel feels like it might be unbearable to face alone. And that exact fear is older than you think. It didn't start with the betrayal you remember most clearly. It started somewhere further back, in a place the mind has gotten remarkably good at hiding from you. There's an old idea in philosophy that gets thrown around a lot but rarely gets felt. The map is not the territory. A map of a city isn't the city itself. It's just lines and symbols representing something far more alive and complicated. And here's where it gets personal. The story you tell yourself about why you hurt is often just a map. It's not the actual territory of the wound. You point to an ex, a parent, a friend who left without a word, and you say that's where it started. But that person, that moment, that's just the map. The territory, the real terrain of the pain, was there long before they ever showed up. Here's an example that makes this land. Imagine someone who reacts with sudden, disproportionate anger whenever a partner is 15 minutes late without texting. From the outside, it looks like the lateness caused the anger. But if you trace it back, you might find a childhood where a parent's unpredictability meant chaos, meant fear, meant a small child sitting by a window not knowing if anyone was coming home at all. The partner being late isn't the wound. It's the doorbell that wakes up a wound that's been sleeping in a back room for 20 years. The lateness is the map reference. The years of feeling forgotten, that's the territory. This matters practically, because if you keep blaming the map, you'll keep trying to fix the wrong thing. You'll change partners, change jobs, change cities, convinced that this new map will finally stop hurting you. And for a while, maybe it does, because the trigger is different. But the territory travels with you. A useful practice here is something therapists call tracing the trigger. Next time you feel a wave of pain that seems too big for the moment, pause and ask, has this exact feeling visited me before? When was the first time? Journaling this honestly, even for 5 minutes a night, starts to reveal the actual shape of the territory underneath the map. Books like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk go deep into how the body holds onto this terrain long after the mind has moved on. And once you start seeing this clearly, something strange happens. You stop being angry at the people who trigger you, because you realize they were never holding the wound. They just happened to walk past the door and knock on it. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the people in your life aren't actually the ones hurting you, then who or what has been doing the real damage all along? There's a voice that's been running the show far longer than you'd like to admit, and it doesn't sound like an enemy at all. It sounds exactly like you. There's a courtroom that exists inside almost every person, and the strange thing is, most people never realize they've been living their entire life as the defendant. Every decision gets cross-examined. Every mistake gets filed away as evidence. And there's a voice, sharp, fast, relentless, that hands down verdicts before you've even finished the sentence in your own head. You always do this. Of course that didn't work out. Who do you think you are? That voice feels like you. It speaks in first person after all. But what if that voice isn't actually you at all? What if it's something else entirely? Something that moved in a long time ago and has been running the tribunal ever since, uninvited and unquestioned. Carl Jung had a name for fragments of the psyche that behave exactly like this. He called them autonomous complexes. The idea is unsettling at first, that parts of your own mind can act almost like separate little personalities, operating outside your conscious control, with their own agenda, their own voice, their own logic. The inner critic is one of the clearest examples of this. It doesn't reason with you. It doesn't wait for permission. It simply activates the moment you stumble, like a judge who was already waiting behind the bench before you even walked into the room. And here's the unsettling part. Most people assume this judge is protecting them, keeping them humble, keeping them safe from disappointment. But a judge that never once says not guilty isn't protecting anyone. It's just punishing. So where did this judge come from? Almost always, it's borrowed. A parent's harsh tone, internalized so early it lost its original voice and started sounding like your own thoughts. A teacher's offhand comment that got filed away as permanent truth. A culture, a religion, a household that ran on conditional love that had to be earned through performance. The complex formed as a kind of early warning system. If I judge myself first, harder and faster than anyone else can, maybe I'll never be caught off guard by judgment from the outside. It's a strategy. A clever one even, but strategies built in childhood don't always update themselves once you're grown, and this one rarely does on its own. Here's something worth trying this week. The next time that inner voice issues a verdict, don't argue with it, and don't obey it either. Just ask it a question instead. Ask, whose voice is this, really? Often if you sit with that question long enough, you'll notice it doesn't even sound like your own thoughts at all once you really listen. It sounds borrowed. It sounds like an old recording playing on a loop. And recordings, no matter how old or how loud, can be turned off. But only once you find where the sound is actually coming from. There's a peculiar kind of intelligence inside the human body and mind that most people spend their whole lives misunderstanding, sometimes even fighting against, when really, it's trying to help. Anxiety, anger, that heavy gray apathy that makes even getting out of bed feel like climbing a mountain. Most people treat these as malfunctions, as if the psyche is simply broken and needs to be fixed, silenced, medicated into submission. But what if these aren't malfunctions at all? What if they're translations? Badly worded, urgent, sometimes clumsy translations of a message that's been trying to reach you for a very long time, in a language you never learned to read. Think of it like a smoke alarm going off in a house. The sound itself is annoying, jarring, even painful to the ears. But nobody in their right mind responds to a smoke alarm by ripping it off the wall and going back to sleep. The alarm isn't the problem. It's pointing at the problem. Anxiety often works exactly like this. It's rarely about the meeting tomorrow or the bill that's due. It's a deeper system flagging something that's gone unaddressed for years, an unmet need, a boundary that's never been spoken, a version of yourself that's been quietly suffocating under obligations you never agreed to in the first place. The anxiety isn't random, it's specific. It just speaks in a code that took your nervous system years to develop and will take patience to decode. Anger works the same way, just louder. Anger nearly always shows up as a bodyguard, standing in front of something far more vulnerable, usually grief, or hurt, or a boundary that's been crossed one too many times in silence. And apathy, that flat, gray nothing feeling, is often what happens when a person has been disappointed so many times that the psyche decides it's safer to stop hoping altogether. Because hope, in the past, has been expensive. A practical place to start untangling this, the next time a strong symptom shows up. Instead of asking, how do I make this stop? Try asking, what is this trying to tell me that I haven't been willing to hear? Write the answer down without editing it. It's uncomfortable work, but it's the same approach explored beautifully in Gabor Mate's When the Body Says No, which is worth reading slowly, not quickly. Here's the part most people never get to, though, because they're so busy trying to silence the alarm that they never ask why the same alarm keeps going off, week after week, year after year, in slightly different rooms of their life. The truth is, symptoms don't just appear once and leave. When they're ignored, they tend to come back, dressed differently, knocking on a different door, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. Repeating the exact same message in the exact same key, just waiting for someone to finally translate it correctly. Here's something that troubles almost everyone who's honest enough to look at their own life closely. The relationship that ended in betrayal somehow finds its echo in the next one, and the one after that. The job that drained you dry gets replaced by another job, different company, same exhausting pattern. The friend who never showed up gets swapped for a new friend who, eventually, does the exact same disappearing act. And the question that haunts people in quiet moments is brutal in its simplicity. Why do I keep ending up here, in the exact place I swore I'd never go back to? Freud called something close to this the repetition compulsion, and Jung built on it in his own way. The idea that the unconscious doesn't actually want to repeat suffering for no reason. It's not masochism. It's an unfinished attempt at resolution. Somewhere, long ago, a wound occurred that never got properly closed. A parent who left without explanation. A love that ended without closure. A need that went unmet without anyone ever acknowledging it happened. And the unconscious, in its strange and somewhat clumsy wisdom, keeps recreating similar situations, hoping that this time it'll get a different outcome. This time, the partner won't leave. This time, the boss will finally see your worth. This time, it'll end differently, except it almost never does, because the pattern is being driven by the old wound, not by present reality. Here's a concrete way to spot this in your own life. Notice if you feel a strange, almost magnetic pull towards someone or something that, on paper, resembles exactly what hurt you before, even though every conscious part of you insists this one is different. That pull is worth paying attention to, not ignoring. A useful practice is mapping your last 3 significant relationships or jobs side by side and asking honestly, what did these have in common, emotionally, even if the people looked nothing alike? Often a pattern surfaces that the conscious mind never would have admitted to on its own. This is also where books like Attached by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller become genuinely useful, especially in understanding how early attachment wounds quietly script adult relationships decades later. The hard truth is that the unconscious will keep running this same experiment, with new actors and new settings, until the original wound is actually witnessed and worked through, not avoided, not white-knuckled past, but truly looked at. And this is where things get strange, because to stop repeating the pattern, you don't actually need a different partner, a different job, or a different city. You need to turn around and face something you've spent years successfully avoiding, something Jung had a very specific and very misunderstood word for. The word shadow tends to scare people the moment they hear it, mostly because it's been misused for decades in pop culture, turned into something sinister, something demonic, the secret monster hiding inside every person. But that's not what Carl Jung meant at all when he introduced the concept, and the misunderstanding has cost a lot of people the chance to actually heal. The shadow isn't the evil inside you. The shadow is everything about you that got exiled. Every trait, every desire, every emotion that didn't fit the image you were taught to present to the world. And so, it got pushed underground. Not because it was bad, but because it was inconvenient. Picture a child who grows up in a home where anger was never allowed. Maybe a parent who punished any sign of frustration or simply couldn't handle it. That child doesn't actually stop feeling anger. Anger is a normal, even necessary human response. What happens instead is the child learns, very quickly, that anger equals danger, equals rejection, equals losing love. So the anger gets split off. It goes underground. It joins the shadow, not because it's monstrous, but because it was never given a safe place to exist. Decades later, that same person might wonder why they explode unexpectedly over small things, or why they feel a strange contempt toward people who express anger openly and easily. That's the shadow, knocking from the basement, asking to finally be let upstairs. This is why integrating the shadow isn't about accepting bad things about yourself, even though that's how it gets oversimplified online. It's closer to this. Imagine going through your closet and finding clothes from years ago that you packed away because someone once told you they didn't suit you. Integration is trying them on again, as an adult, and asking honestly, does this actually not suit me, or did I just believe that because I was told so once, by someone who had their own reasons for saying it? A practical exercise here is noticing what kind of people irritate you the most. Loud people, ambitious people, emotional people, selfish people. Because very often, the trait that irritates you most in others is the exact trait you were never allowed to express in yourself. Jung wrote about this extensively in Aeon, describing the shadow not as something to defeat, but something to meet, almost like meeting an estranged relative you were taught to be ashamed of, only to discover they were never the threat everyone made them out to be. And once a person starts genuinely meeting their shadow instead of fighting it, something curious happens. They don't become darker or more dangerous. They become more whole. But wholeness, as it turns out, requires giving up something else first. Something most people are far less willing to release than their anger, their jealousy, or their pride. Every person, without exception, wears a mask of some kind, and contrary to what self-help culture often implies, that's not automatically a tragedy. Jung called this the persona, borrowing the word directly from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is the curated version of you that meets the world, the professional tone at work, the easygoing friend at a party, the patient parent at the dinner table even on an exhausting day. The persona exists for a genuinely good reason. Nobody could function in society showing every raw, unfiltered emotion at every moment. The mask isn't the enemy. The mask is a tool. The problem only begins when somebody forgets they're wearing one. Here's how that forgetting tends to happen. Slowly, almost invisibly, a young professional starts wearing the mask of the reliable one at work. Never says no, never shows stress, always delivers. At first, it's strategic. It gets them promoted, praised, trusted. But 10 years pass, and one day they realize they don't actually know what they'd say if someone asked, "What do you actually want?" separate from what's expected of you. The mask got so good, so convincing, so rewarded, that it quietly replaced the face underneath it. This is the exact moment the persona stops being a tool and starts being a kind of identity theft, except the thief and the victim happen to be the very same person. You can usually spot this happening in your own life by paying attention to exhaustion that doesn't match the workload. If a single conversation, a single social event, a single ordinary day at work leaves you feeling strangely depleted, not from effort, but from the sheer energy it took to maintain a certain image, that's often the persona working overtime. A useful practice is to ask, at the end of particularly draining days, was I tired because the task was hard, or because I had to perform being a certain way the entire time? Naming the difference, honestly, even just in a journal, starts to loosen the mask's grip without requiring you to throw it away entirely. Because here's the part that often gets missed in the rush to be authentic. The answer isn't to rip the mask off and never wear one again. Some masks are necessary, even kind. The goal is simply to remember, clearly, that the face underneath still exists, still breathes, still has its own preferences separate from the role. The real danger was never the mask itself. It was forgetting there was ever a face under there to protect in the first place. And once a person starts looking for that face again, they tend to discover something they weren't expecting at all. That finding it again feels less like a discovery and more like a kind of loss. There's a kind of grief almost nobody talks about, mostly because it doesn't come with a funeral, a casket, or a date anyone can mark on a calendar. It's the grief of mourning a version of yourself that never got to exist. Jung called the process of becoming a fully integrated person individuation, and it's usually described in hopeful, almost glamorous language: growth, transformation, becoming who you truly are. But what rarely gets mentioned is that individuation isn't only a gain, it's also a genuine loss, and pretending otherwise robs people of the chance to actually grieve what needs grieving. Think about the person who spent 20 years being the strong one in their family, the one everyone leaned on, the one who never fell apart, even when falling apart would have been completely reasonable. At some point, that person begins the slow work of individuation, of becoming someone who's allowed to need help too. On paper, that sounds like pure growth. But underneath it, there's a quieter, harder truth. They have to say goodbye to the version of themselves who was needed unconditionally, who had a clear role, who knew exactly who they were supposed to be in every room. That role gave them an identity, even if it was an exhausting one. Letting it go means losing something real, even if what they're gaining is far healthier. This is why individuation often comes with a strange wave of sadness that catches people off guard. Sadness that shows up right when life is supposedly getting better. Someone finally sets a boundary they'd avoided for years, and instead of feeling triumphant, they feel oddly hollow, even guilty. That hollowness isn't a sign that something went wrong. It's grief, doing exactly what grief does, marking the death of an old identity so a new one has room to actually take root. A practical way to honor this, rather than rush past it. When you notice that hollow feeling after a positive change, try saying out loud, even just to yourself, "I'm allowed to miss who I used to be, even though I don't want to go back." That single sentence does more healing than most people expect. This is also often where people quietly stall in their own growth, not because change is too hard, but because nobody warned them that growth requires a funeral of sorts, and grief by nature takes time that the modern world rarely makes room for. The people who individuate most successfully aren't the ones who feel no sadness about who they're leaving behind. They're the ones who let themselves mourn it fully, without rushing the process. And what waits for them on the other side of that mourning is something most people mistake for emptiness, when really, it's just unfamiliar quiet. There comes a point in almost every person's growth where the room starts to feel a little emptier, not because anyone left dramatically, but because conversations that used to feel effortless start to feel like translation work. Friends who once understood you instantly now require explaining things you didn't used to have to explain. Family gatherings that used to feel warm now feel like sitting at a table where everyone's speaking a language you used to speak fluently and somehow don't anymore. This is one of the most disorienting parts of growth, and almost nobody prepares you for it. The people don't have to disappear for the distance to grow. Here's the distinction that matters more than almost anything else at this stage. There's a profound difference between solitude and isolation, even though they can look identical from the outside. Isolation is driven by fear, the quiet withdrawal of someone who's been hurt and decided, consciously or not, that staying invisible is safer than risking connection again. Solitude, on the other hand, is often a sign of expansion. It's what happens when a person has genuinely changed, and the old conversations, the old group dynamics, the old inside jokes simply don't fit anymore, the same way a coat you wore as a teenager doesn't fit your adult shoulders. One is a wound hiding, the other is growth, simply requiring space to settle before it finds its new community. A practical way to tell which one you're experiencing is to ask yourself honestly, if the right person showed up tomorrow, someone who truly understood this new version of me, would I let them in? If the answer is an immediate, even nervous yes, you're likely in solitude. Temporary, transitional, not permanent. But if the honest answer is probably not, I'd probably find a reason to keep them at a distance too, that's worth examining closely, because that's isolation wearing solitude's clothing. This is also the stage where it helps enormously to seek out smaller, more intentional communities, a single deep friendship rather than a wide, shallow circle, a small philosophy or psychology reading group rather than constant noise. Because growth at this stage rarely needs more people, it needs the right few. The painful part nobody softens for you is this: outgrowing certain relationships doesn't mean those relationships were fake, or that the people in them were wrong for you back then. It often just means you grew toward something they weren't growing toward at the same time, in the same direction. That's not betrayal. That's simply two paths diverging after walking together for a while. And once a person accepts that this particular kind of solitude is not abandonment, but evidence of arrival somewhere new, a final and much harder question tends to surface. If you're no longer the person who needs everyone's approval to feel safe, then who exactly are you becoming? Now that nothing outside of you is required to hold you together, there's a particular kind of person that emerges at the end of deep inner work, and from the outside, they can look almost unmoved, calm in situations where others would spiral, steady where others would scramble for reassurance. It's tempting to assume this person has simply stopped feeling, that all that shadow work and self-confrontation hardened them into something untouchable. But that assumption misses the actual destination of this entire journey. The goal was never numbness. Numbness is the absence of feeling. What this person has actually built is something far rarer, the ability to feel everything fully and still remain standing, still remain themselves, without being swept away by the current. Here's a concrete way to see the difference. Picture two people receiving the exact same piece of devastating news, say being passed over for a promotion they'd worked years toward. The first person goes numb, smiles politely, says it's fine, and changes the subject within 30 seconds, because actually feeling the disappointment feels too dangerous to risk. That's not strength. That's the armor from topic 1, still doing its old job. The second person, though, lets their face fall, says honestly, "Wow, that really hurts. I'm disappointed." Sits with that disappointment for the evening without spiraling into self-attack or blaming everyone around them. And then, by morning, gets up and asks what the next move actually is. That second person isn't intouchable. They're integrated. They felt the full weight of it without collapsing under it. This is the practical skill worth building, and it can genuinely be trained like a muscle. Next time something painful happens, try this exact sequence instead of either suppressing it or drowning in it. First, name the feeling out loud or in writing. Specifically, not, "I'm upset, but I feel humiliated," or "I feel scared I'm not good enough." Second, give it a defined window of time to exist fully, even 20 minutes, without trying to fix it or explain it away. Third, after that window, ask one grounded question. What is actually true right now, separate from how intense this feeling is? This 3-step sequence, used consistently, is close to what's taught in dialectical behavior therapy, and Marsha Linehan's work on emotional regulation is genuinely worth exploring further if this resonates. This is the real, hard-won destination of everything explored up to this point. The armor finally comes off, not because the world became safe, but because the person underneath it became someone who no longer needs armor to survive contact with pain. The wounds don't disappear, the triggers don't vanish completely, but something fundamental shifts in how all of it is metabolized. And for the first time, a person can say something that sounds almost impossible, yet is finally, quietly, completely true for them. So here's where it all comes together, and here's the question you actually have to sit with. Not just nod along to of everything covered today. Which one hit closest to home? Was it the armor you built so long ago you forgot you were still wearing it? Was it the inner judge, handing down verdicts in a voice that was never really yours to begin with? Or was it the quiet grief for the version of you who never got permission to exist? Whichever one it was, that's not a coincidence. That's the exact place this work needs to begin, for you. Because here's the truth, nobody can soften for you. None of this changes anything if it stays as something you watched. The person who finally stops repeating the same painful pattern isn't the one who understood the pattern intellectually. It's the one who sat down tonight, even for 10 minutes, and asked, where did this actually start for me? The person who finally feels lighter isn't the one who memorized the concept of the shadow. It's the one who noticed, this week, exactly which trait in other people irritates them the most, and had the courage to ask why. Knowledge that stays in the mind changes nothing. Knowledge that gets applied, even imperfectly, even clumsily, starts to dismantle armor that's been welded shut for decades. So ask yourself, right now, before you close this and move on to the next thing demanding your attention, what's one mask you're ready to loosen, even slightly, starting today? Who is one person you could be a little more honest with this week, instead of performing the version of you they expect? What's one old wound you've been blaming on someone else, when really, it's been waiting patiently for you to finally turn around and look at it directly? You don't need to have all the answers tonight. You just need to be willing to ask the questions honestly, and let the answers come when they're ready. If something in this video reached you, if even one sentence felt like it was written specifically for what you've been carrying, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this is exactly the kind of work that needs to be revisited, layer by layer, video by video, until it stops being information you consumed and starts being a transformation you actually live. There's more waiting for you here, deeper layers, harder truths, the kind that don't show up in a single watch. So stay. Keep going, because the moment you stop outsourcing your peace to people and circumstances outside your control is the moment this title finally becomes your reality, and that moment is closer than you think.